and thank you for joining our Teach-In for the 21st Century webinars brought to you by the David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Glazov Gang. I'm your host, Annie Cyrus. If you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box you see on your screen. I am extremely excited. I have literally counted moments for this moment where I get to introduce our very, very special guest for tonight's webinar. To me, she's the most beautiful, amazing, brave, courageous woman walking the planet Earth. She is Katie Hopkins. Katie, such an honor to have you on tonight.
Thank you for all those kind words. That was very lovely of you indeed. I'm very grateful that you've had me on, and I'm thrilled that we're joined by so many people. Thank you very much indeed.
Of course, I'm sure everyone is as excited as I am and very curious as to what is the topic for tonight. So, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So, here's my cunning plan for this evening. So first up, like we said, thank you so much to the Horowitz Freedom Center for hosting this, and to all the team there for helping set this up. I really appreciate it. My name, as many of you may know, is Katie Hopkins, and this webinar is entitled Britain, Boris, and the Nightmare That Is Socialized Healthcare. So that's the general theme, and as many of you who know me will know, it's likely to go off in any number of different directions. If you don't know me, I guess I should try and introduce myself. There's a sort of formal way of introducing myself, which would be that I am a graduate of the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. I was sponsored through Sandhurst by the Intelligence Corps, and I was offered a 35-year regular commission. After my time in the Army, I went to join a major management consultancy firm and spent, I guess, 10 years working with large corporates before I joined the media, the mainstream media, and became a columnist and also a radio host. Latterly, all of those things have been removed from me because my opinions are not seen as being acceptable to the narrative. However, that is my background. The less formal introduction of myself goes along the lines of biggest bitch in Britain. So I am known for being forthright. I am known for not holding back. I'm known sometimes as the female Farage, although I have better teeth, and sometimes the angry Ellen DeGeneres that came about when my hair was shorter. I'm known for kind of saying things that other people might flinch from saying. And I spend my time now on the road, or I did until this lockdown happened, and telling the truths from the road. So I go to the places other people, other media won't go to try to show people the truth of what's actually going on. And I see that as my mission in this fight back for our Judeo-Christian heritage. So that's a little bit about me, with where we are at right now, some of the facts and the stats about what's going on. The UK was locked down on the 23rd of May this year. And the key thing that's going to be going on here in this conversation that is different from the USA is that we live with socialized healthcare. We have the National Health Service. And in many ways, if I could ask you to look through everything I'm saying through a pair of glasses, that's what I need you to imagine, is that everything you're about to hear needs to go through the lens of socialized healthcare, because in my personal opinion, it changes everything. So there are many things that you might say at home, oh, we have that here. Oh, yes, that's going on here. I can absolutely confirm that socialized healthcare changes so much about what is fundamental to freedom, particularly freedom in America, which is the ultimate land of the free. So we were locked down on the 23rd of March, 2020. And for a good while there, Boris Johnson looked like he was resisting the lockdown. I was cheering him. I was in New York as it locked down, cheering Boris along, because he looked like he was kind of going to go firm, that he would allow things to remain open, and that he was going to explore what opportunities might work for the UK. It was the Boris that I knew, the Boris that I love, and the Boris that I championed very hard in America, as many of you will have heard me do. Now, the UK so far has had 230,000 confirmed cases of COVID, and our deaths are 33,614. I updated that just before I jumped on here with you good people. So, as with many other countries, including your own, these are deaths, 33,614 deaths with or from COVID. And I'm sure majority of my good listeners out there will know what this means, but essentially whether you died because of COVID or whether you simply died and COVID was present, you're counted as a COVID death in the UK. Furthermore, the state is not required to test you for COVID to prove that to be the case. It can just be assumed that you're a COVID death. And I have innumerable emails from family members very upset that they've seen on the death certificate. You will relate to this story, I'm sure, COVID deaths when there was no such sign of COVID being present. We remain under lockdown today. In phase 1, the slogan that was being used was stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. Very clear, 3 things: stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. And it was all about flattening the curve. Everything was about flattening the curve, about stopping our socialized healthcare being overwhelmed. And one of the things that happened because of this need to flatten the curve to protect the NHS, it's the key message. I can't tell you, I've walked home this evening at 8 p.m. my time. People are still outside banging their pots and pans together at 8 p.m. in the evening to show them sort of, I don't know, to indicate their superiority to their neighbours in that they're still supporting the NHS. There's a craziness going on in the UK. Anywho, it was all about flattening the curve, supporting the NHS, protecting them. And as a result, in the UK, all cancer treatment was stopped. All coronary and heart-related treatment was stopped. People who had life-ending and life-threatening conditions saw their treatment stop immediately, and that is still true today. There are no cancer treatments going on in the UK. My personal friend who has terminal cancer saw her treatment stop immediately, her chemotherapy stop immediately, and clearly for many terminal cancer patients, it's mean that they're locked down, unable to see anybody, but they cannot access healthcare. And this is my point about socialized healthcare really changing the way that lockdown works. We also built emergency hospitals for no apparent reason that I can see. They appear to me to be the white elephant of our time. We built 17 emergency Nightingale hospitals. The one in London had 4,000 beds. It only ever saw 50 patients. Some patients were turned away because there was not staff to staff the emergency hospitals that were built, although those were, of course, open to massive fanfare. So much like other countries saw huge emergency hospitals being thrown up at speed, no real thought or planning behind them, never used, and now they have been shut down because they weren't required. The statistics from a fact base here in the UK, 88% of those who died from COVID were over the age of 65. And actually that's, when I look at the proportion, 79% of those who died from COVID in the UK with or from COVID were over the age of 88. So nearly 80% over the age of 88. I'm sure many of you are going to relate to it's the same here. Well, it's the same here. And again, the thing you will have seen as well, of course, most had underlying health conditions. And even when the media went with a big fanfare for a 19-year-old, the youngest COVID death, because of course they were perpetuating that fear, it turned out that gentleman very sadly had leukemia. So that's a lot of what's going on here as well. In terms of what's locked down, everything. All businesses, restaurants, bars, public services. And as that has just been changed this week to saying, if you really can't work from home, you can go to work, construction and manufacturing are allowed to go to work. but because of sabotage being conducted by our Muslim mayor in London, who runs the transport services, transport is down to 1/10 of its actual rate. So we do not have a functioning bus service. We do not have a functioning underground, which is putting crowding and pressure on transport, which means people are too afraid to come back to work. Now, the key point here in the UK that marks a really strong difference to the USA is that here in the UK, 49% of the British workforce are currently paid by the British taxpayer. They are currently being paid by the British government. When the British government shut down the UK, which is still shut down, the government launched a hugely generous furlough scheme. It pays up to 80% of your wages each month, £2,500 a month, that's $3,200 perhaps. Over 9 million employees in the UK are currently sitting on furlough. It is costing us the equivalent funding that would usually go to fund our NHS. And we are now spending, in order to keep people's wages going, the same sort of amounts. We have got the same sort of debt that we accrued in World War II. And I think that's the sort of same numbers that are coming out of the USA. And there is a suggestion that unemployment will be at around 20%. Again, a very similar figure to the USA. What is different here is this furlough scheme, where essentially the taxpayer is paying people's wages. They still are therefore employed by firms, but of course, when the firms come to take over those employees, they are going to need to make these people redundant because the demand isn't there. So in many ways, what Britain now has is zombie businesses holding capital, holding labour that cannot be released because these individuals are being paid. And there is going to come a massive crunch point at the end of August when employers start taking back those salaries and having to pay a percentage of them. That's when we're going to see mass redundancies. And that's why you might not have heard of those yet. Now, on a final point in this section, if I may, as Boris tries to encourage people to go back to work, what we're seeing is a massive political movement to overthrow Boris and what he wants to happen. We've got the unions coming out, trying to stop the transport, as I referred to. We have the teachers coming out. They are trying to get parents not to send their children back to school. I have a letter here from a school head. She runs a number of schools. And in this letter, it is essentially a letter trying to convince parents not to do as the government has requested, not to send children back to school on the 1st of June, and to keep your children at home. It reminds people you won't be fined for keeping your children at home. You won't be in trouble for keeping them at home. And we strongly recommend that you do that. So that's what's going on politically in this country, is that the unions and the left are trying to encourage people to defy the government's wish that people start to go back to work. Now, if I may, what I'd like to do is move on to what I think is much more interesting, which is the story behind the story. So those are our death rates, those are the numbers, that's our economy, that's our furlough scheme, that's the unions trying to resist any type of going back. What I want to talk to you about now is what's going on, the intelligence behind that. So Boris was initially being the bad boy of Europe, and I was enjoying it very much. He was being the Boris that I love, flamboyant Boris. Maybe we'll see how this pans out. Let's keep things open and see what happens. All of a sudden, that got pulled right back. Boris Johnson, at that point, was personally unwell. He later went on to contract COVID. His new girlfriend was having a baby, is having a baby, has had her baby Wilfred. And I believe he became terrified of what might happen. And as a result, he suddenly changed his position entirely. He lost everything that was Boris about Bojo, and he turned into something different. And we heard a phrase that you guys will have heard a lot. Many of our listeners will have heard it was, we're going to be led by the science. Everything changed from flamboyant Boris and let's do this and we'll get through this and Britain is better than this too. We're going to be led by the science. And as soon as we heard that narrative, led by the science, things changed dramatically. Now, there are distinct parallels here with the US. Our chief science guys, there's two of them. One's called Whitty and one is called Ferguson. You may have heard of Ferguson. We'll come to him in a minute. He is very much your Fauci. Fauci and Ferguson know each other well. They share a lot in common. We're basically playing from the same playbook. Let me just tell you about Whitty a moment. He is our chief medical advisor. I'm just finding what his role was. Whitty is from the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. It's one of those names, isn't it? Made boring enough so that you turn the other way. The CEPI, launched at Davos in 2017 by the governments of Norway and India and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. What a surprise. It won't surprise you either to find out that our chief medical advisor, now taking over effectively from Boris Johnson, he was on the interim board of this organisation. Whilst he was on that board, he got the government to invest £50 million in the CEPI, and this gentleman Whitty, I say gentleman loosely, also received Gates funding, Bill Gates funding in 2008, £14 million for malaria research in Africa. And Whitty also chairs, unbelievably, but yet somehow tragically, believably, he chairs the UK vaccine network. And of course, if I was to sit here now with a whiteboard, which actually I'd love to do, I love a whiteboard. I love post-it notes as well. Look, here's my timings, post-it notes everywhere. So if I could sit here with a whiteboard, I would, which is basically drawing you a spider's web of how these chief medical officers, as you'll have seen with Fauci, are linked to the WHO, they're linked to the CEPI, they're linked to the vaccine network, and of course, Bill Gates is always sat there somewhere in the middle. Let me tell you about our other scientific advisor, Ferguson, Neil Ferguson, links with Fauci. He became known, very sadly for him, as Professor Pants Down. Now let me explain this slightly tabloid analogy. Neil Ferguson is the guy behind the modelling. He said there would be 500,000 deaths from COVID in the UK, 500,000 deaths. Now, when Boris Johnson said he was going to be guided by the science, he was guided by this guy. 500,000 deaths, he said there would be. Now, he has a track record. Let me just read you a couple things. His track record is this. For bird flu, he said there would be 200 million deaths globally. There were 282. For swine flu, he said there would be 65,000 deaths in the UK. There were 457. For foot and mouth, for mad cow disease, a disease that I obviously relate to, he said there could be up to 50,000 deaths. There were 177. And unbelievably, a guy with this track record in statistical modelling of pandemics, he modelled COVID. He said there would be 500,000 deaths possibly. Boris Johnson started to listen to him, and that's when Boris completely changed. Now, what happened in addition to that, not only is his modelling more dodgy than a watch that I may have purchased from a small shop in the back streets of Hong Kong, but he, during the time of lockdown, when he locked us down, he was getting his mistress, a married lady, to come and visit him in his home for their relationship. That's actually, frankly, none of my business nor yours. It's the fact that whilst he locked us down, he was getting his mistress to travel across London to his home, where she spent several evenings. So he got the name Professor Pants Down because the very gentleman locking us down was still meeting people, meeting his mistress, and doing things we really don't need to know about. So 2 points there. One, his modelling and his reputation has been shocking while we're listening. 2, the sheer hypocrisy of these medics. And of course, 3, the fact that you can see just how it is with these medical officers and how they are linked to these vaccine networks and why, of course, that makes us so suspicious. Now, the reality of our deaths being just about the elderly, the very old, and those with those underlying health conditions has led to these Nightingales hospitals being utterly redundant. They are a white elephant. If anything indicates why this professor was utterly wrong in his modelling, is it not 17 empty emergency hospitals? And yet the sheeple, the brainwashed in the UK, think it's a great thing. They'll say, isn't it a great thing, Katie, that we didn't have to go down that route? Isn't that a great thing? No, it's not a great thing at all. It just shows that we listened to the wrong person. And of course, any evidence that we need that you could have done all of this without the lockdown is right there in Sweden. The aim in Sweden was different to all the aims we've seen in the UK. The aim in the UK appears to have been no deaths at any cost, save lives at any cost. In Sweden, their aim, was to keep the spread down whilst society functions. They kept everything open. They didn't lock down anything, and they didn't use fear to shut people in their home. Swedish people have a lot of faith and trust in their government and their media for good reason. A survey of Swedes said that only 5 or 10% of Swedes fear the epidemic. Their biggest fear is losing their job. And that is why the Swedish approach, in my personal opinion, has always been the correct approach, because they didn't get, their scientific advice seemed to be much more appropriate. They didn't use fear as a tool to shut people into their homes. Their goal was to keep the spread down whilst society was allowed to function. They had a very specific tracking tool in place almost immediately. And they used sort of techniques like banning gatherings of 50 people plus. They banned visits to nursing homes, but overall they sort of did the Swedish thing of asking people politely to be a bit more cautious. And Swedes being Swedes, that's absolutely what they did. And I believe Sweden is the ultimate success model of why you don't lock down, why you don't get blinded by fear, where Britain still is stuck in fear now. And the Swedish people have absolutely not had that fear. And of course, they have not had these huge hospitals sitting there unused, and nor have they had to have, as Britain has, cancer patients and those with life-ending conditions sat in their homes, unable to get treatment in the NHS, despite the fact that I get emails from doctors and nurses telling me our British hospitals are all but empty. I mean, that's the tragic reality of living under socialised healthcare. Now, let me move on, if I may, to my final section. Do keep putting your questions in. Do ask anything you wish to ask, and we will get to those questions later. As I move to the final section, if I may, of this webinar, is really a discussion of these two places, this brilliant place and this place I live in, the UK. So a comparison really between the UK and the USA. And the first thing I need to say, and it's something I'll return to, is a massive thank you to not only the 64 million Americans that voted for Donald Trump, but to all the brilliant Americans who are in touch with me on Twitter or who joined some of the reopen protests, or rather assertions of your freedoms, who were always wanting this lockdown to be over, who thought it was ridiculous in the first place, and have been out there really gunning to get your freedoms back or to protect them. Because in the darkest moments here in the UK, and there have been some darkest hours, it is to the US that I look for hope. And so to all of you that have been part of that, really thank you. And I do feel there's many people in Britain that would extend their thanks to you as well, because you've really kept that light going and times when it's been very dark here. So one of the key things that I've observed is the real difference between Brits and Americans. And obviously I see that daily anyway. You guys speak to each other in the elevator, you say hello to each other in the street, you have things like customer service and all the rest of it. But those aren't the only differences. The differences here are people are terrified. People are too frightened to come out of their homes. I have family members who have not gone out of their homes since lockdown began. And there are also people who feel policed by their neighbours, as they are. They feel policed by other family members, and they are utterly terrified when you pass them in the street They look at you like you're going to kill them. There's other people who feel somehow elevated to the role of police who tell you off in the street now for no reason. And mostly there's just a feeling of all pervasive fear that exists here in the UK. People aren't going to go back to work because they're too afraid. School teachers don't want to go back to work, partly because they're being paid, partly because they're too afraid. Fear has been hardwired into the UK, and that is not a technique that Trump used, and it's not a technique that Americans are likely to swallow, because you have freedom hardwired into your soul, and Brits now have fear hardwired into their soul. The other thing I wanted to draw parallels between is that Trump has very much followed what's best for America. So for a while that was lockdowns, but then now it's all about rebuilding America. It's about this whole, about seeing America as a whole thing. And that's what he's trying to do, look after the whole of America. Britain hasn't done that at all. Britain has tried to do this thing of keeping the death toll as low as possible at all costs. And as a result, everything is falling by the wayside. Nobody knows what's going to be left. And people are fearful, and our children are fearful. I have a family member whose daughter has not left the house for the whole of the lockdown, and she does not want to leave the house now. And that to me is what a real tragedy of this thing. What on earth have we done to our young people? Some of the other parallels that I wanted to draw, as you've heard, from Dr. Fauci to Ferguson, that same use of medical and science, two gentlemen who are somehow seen as it's the sort of God delusion, because they're scientists, we must believe them. And yet those two, Ferguson and Fauci, very heavily linked, all sponsored by Bill Gates and all linked to vaccine networks. And it's a curious thing when politicians default to scientific medical advisors. I think there was a period where Trump was engaging with that, and it was great to see him start to resist that more recently. Boris Johnson is very much still in the thrall of the science, and I think that's where we're all starting to lose faith in him. I think the other thing that's different between the US and the UK is that when the US loses jobs, it does it hard and fast, and that is not pleasant to see. However, there's a good thing that happens when people are culled. Your unemployment rate will fall to around 20%, but it does it fast. You know where you're at. In the UK, what we've done with this furlough scheme is create a false ceiling. All of these individuals are sat at home, being paid a monthly wage. Many of them are actually quite enjoying it because it's a paid holiday. It's been sunny here, surprisingly, for the UK. And that some of them have no idea that what they actually are is unemployed. They just don't know it yet. And using the sort of slaughterhouse analogy, if you're going to cull people, as we always said in business, the best way to do it is to do it fast. Here in the UK, it's like you can smell the slaughterhouse coming, and yet it's just going to be drawn out in a very painful process that's going to cost us more than we pay into our NHS, and is going to give us the sort of debt that we had in World War II that took decades to pay back. Other two differences I want to highlight before I stop talking, which will be a relief to you all. My husband says I never stop talking, and of course he's very much enjoyed being talked at 24/7 by me under lockdown. I'm surprised we're still married. Anywho, and I did ask Donald Jr. to marry me last time I saw him. However, two other differences. Number one, your adorable Constitution, which I have by my bedside. I sleep with it, I travel with it. It goes in my little backpack when I'm on the road. And when I'm generally being obnoxious somewhere, your Constitution is in my back pocket, because that is what separates you from us. That is what makes you brilliant, brilliant nation. And that is by which you should live and die. If I could print, in fact, that wouldn't have been a brilliant thing. If I'd got a thought of this before and realized lunatics were going to mass purchase bathroom roll, toilet paper, I could have got printed the American Constitution onto bathroom roll, and then idiotic lefties would have purchased the toilet paper and they would have been reading the Constitution as they sat there. This is a great idea. We must discuss this with Horowitz Freedom Centre. Bathroom paper printed with the Constitution, so that when people stockpile in a pandemic in future, they read the Constitution. Anywho, back to topic. I did say I would digress. You have a Constitution. Love it dearly. It's what keeps your freedoms. And it's why we, the sheeple out there, are on bended knee to this government. And you will have seen the changing of laws here and in New Zealand. In New Zealand, they just passed a law that says people can be arrested in their own home without a warrant. In New Zealand, they passed a law that says businesses can be shut down without a reason, without giving any reason why, and it can be shut down by a government official if the Prime Minister says so. This is the darkness that's befalling other nations that don't have a constitution. And the second thing, and my final point about why you guys are amazing and we have failed the corona test, but you are going to prevail, is that you have your Second Amendment. And of course, it is always the case that you, because of your Second Amendment, you have your first. Because of your Second Amendment, you have been able to keep your freedoms. And I believe that is why you have had the brilliant, defiant moments, the moments where you have had the protest to end the lockdown and the gentlemen with their weapons on in Capitol buildings, the Colorado cafe that tried to stay open, the salon owner, how do you say that in American? Salon, don't know. The salon owner that stayed open and defied the lockdown, and Elon Musk, who'd have thought it? I've always loved him. Of course, he could be husband number 4 or 5, but the fact that he defied them as well, it's that Second Amendment that makes you have that spirit of defiance that's made America win at that thing and has left all of this nation, as I look around me, on its knees, fearful to go out, fearful of breaking any rules, utterly compliant. And what upset me the most about this whole thing is really how quickly I watched my country fall into line, how quickly people gave up everything and were compliant, and how willingly and readily everybody here in the UK was locked down. So America remains the land of the free. I'm watching Trump every day saying, we're going back to school, we're going back to business. People on Twitter saying they're in a traffic jam, what do you call that, a traffic line, and they're enjoying it because it's just so glorious to see people out and about. So to end, if I may, in brief, we talked about the facts. We talked about some of the intelligence behind the facts. We talked about the comparison between the US and why, if I may make one plea, not only that you value your constitution, that you treasure your Second Amendment, is that what you definitely don't want in brilliant free America is socialized healthcare, because that is what's been the curse of this coronavirus for us. So with that, I'm going to take a sip of my drink.
Okay, before we get to questions, I think I can speak on behalf of every American you mentioned that we should say thank you, Katie, because as you mentioned, we have an awesome constitution that allows us to push and speak the truth. You speak the truth every day without the protection us Americans have. So thank you for being brave enough to do that.
Thank you.
Oh, of course, I promise you, I'm sure I said that on behalf of millions of Americans, everyone watching. I can see on the comment that somebody just said, hear, hear.
Bless them, thank you.
Of course. However, we have a lot of questions. So I'm gonna start reading the questions for you, and we're gonna try to answer as many as possible.
Sure, and what I will try and do is keep my answers relatively short so we can power through, because I think powering through questions is very much the way.
This sounds great. Here's the first one. Why are the UK faking the causes of death?
And part of this lockdown, and it was a deliberate decision, I've seen the paperwork on the part of the government, was to push fear. They believed, the British government believed, the best way to get British people to stay in their homes was to terrify them. So we had the endless pictures of the coffins. We had pictures of people who you might look and think, oh, that looks a bit like a relative of mine. Then we had those deaths so that people were afraid. Then we had young people, so they tortured us that way. And then by trying to make those death numbers bigger and bigger, it almost became a case that because Professor Pantsdown said we may have 500,000, they needed to find those numbers to almost justify the magnitude of this lockdown. And as we start to move through this and other people start to wake up and realize that these numbers were never terrifying, that actually they were only slightly terrifying if you were over the age of 80. And many beautiful 80-year-olds I know were like, we're good with this. We've had our time For goodness sake, let the young people go. But it became like a self-perpetuating thing. In order to keep us afraid, they needed the numbers, and they went out to find them wherever they could. And then they started making them up without even doing a test. And I think that's been something that you've seen in America, and lots of other countries have seen those sorts of things happening as well.
Next question says, how do you think Boris has done in terms of the Brexit negotiations? How would you do it differently?
Yeah, so brilliant, brilliant Boris. I love Boris. I couldn't love him more. You know, I would have obviously been his next girlfriend. I was never given that offer. He speaks Latin fluently, Greek fluently. He can recite Homer's Odyssey from memory. He's just called his last child Wilfred. And actually Wikipedia doesn't even know how many children Boris has had. I mean, he's that kind of a guy, and I can't help but love him. However, what we've seen over the corona crisis has been a horror story. He has gone from being that Boris, bombast Boris, upbeat Boris, Boris, I'm going to make Brexit happen. I'm going to go back to the voters. I'm going to get a majority, and I'm going to push this thing through. And he did exactly that. And I can't tell you, I loved him so much back on the 12th of December last year. But since he became poorly, and I really believe this is the root of the issue, since he contracted COVID himself, he became very seriously ill. What with his new child on the way as well, I think it just blew his tiny mind. He lost all his soul, and suddenly it was all about the science and the scientists. And we have seen an endless procession of very dull politicians telling us things we don't need to know, and that the country has lost its heart because we lost Boris. The Brexit negotiations up until COVID hit it was genius. He was saying, we are doing this. If you don't like it, off you go. This is the deadline. You don't like it, off you go. My big fear, as many of Americans will understand, watching this derailment of Trump that's trying to happen, that won't succeed, is this also is a derailment of Brexit. There was a suggestion by the left as this pandemic swept that perhaps Britain should go back to the people again to see if they wanted to leave the EU. So that's the sort of conversation that's going on here. That's what happens with our socialised healthcare, which is mostly run by leftist doctors. And there's this sense of, if you criticise the NHS, you don't deserve healthcare. If you voted Brexit, you don't deserve healthcare. And that's this really nasty link between politics and socialised healthcare, is doctors start telling you you don't deserve it if you voted Brexit or if you voted Trump. Okay, sorry, that was a little long.
No, that was very informative. But next question is actually, I'm going to add something to it. Considering it is Ramadan, I don't know what's happening in UK, but the question is, how much are Muslims getting away with lockdown while the non-Muslims are actually locked down?
Absolutely. And the best sort of metric I can give to that is, clearly coronavirus is racist because everything's racist. And there is statistics that show BAME, Black ethnic minority individuals, are hit harder by corona. But I would suggest, and looking at footage that I often receive from individuals who can't disclose themselves, Muslims has carried on largely as normal during lockdown. Large groups, large gatherings of families in small crowded accommodations. And that to me is why those numbers are much higher in those kind of communities. We've been fortunate in Britain. I have not heard the call to prayer being blasted out as it is in Canada and other places. It does make you wonder why in lockdown you'd need the call to prayer blasted out. But I am always, always fearful of what's going on. And I think one of the examples I'd like to direct people to, and perhaps they'd like to look at it themselves later, is New Zealand. You will know that Jacinda Ardern was the one that, after the horrible attack on a mosque in New Zealand, she was the one that went with the full head shawl covering. She had the call to prayer blasted out across New Zealand. Well, she's the one who's just implemented the most draconian laws anyone has ever seen, where you can be arrested without a warrant, your home search without a warrant, shut down your business with no reason. Those rules were brought in, those new laws were brought in 48 hours under the cover of corona. So I think it's things like that, those who are strongly allied with the Islamists, who appear to be making a march whilst people are distracted. And that's my big concern here in the UK, is what is going on whilst we're being distracted, because we are already a minority. I am a minority in London, in Luton, in Bradford, in Birmingham, in Leicester. You know, in 5 years, whites are a minority in this country, and it doesn't take much of a distraction for the Muslim increasing majority to steal a march while we look the other way.
If you don't mind me adding something here, Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, said that anyone who dies of a pandemic is a martyr, because Allah would not put you through the suffering of a pandemic unless He had plans to cleanse you of your sins by killing you.
Mm.
So they're not going to go hiding, and they're going to go lecture lines and try to commit jihad, through health jihad, to kill non-Muslims. But you kind of answered this next question, but I will still read it just in case if you want to expand. The question is, why and how do you think New Zealand have been so successful in tackling the virus, only recording 21 deaths?
Yes. So New Zealand have been very successful in that manner. Number one, because their population is spread out hugely. They have a tiny population spread out over a massive area. So because Jacinda went straight into lockdown, effectively you're locking down people. If you imagine it in your own home, we were locked down in maybe one room. In New Zealand, it's effectively locking people down in individual rooms separate from each other. So that's one of the reasons they were so successful. They did a lot of testing and a lot of tracing. So test and trace seems to be a way of keeping those numbers down. What concerns me in some ways, and not that I wish ill on the New Zealand population at all, is that because Jacinda is being lauded so greatly for keeping those numbers down and for the lockdown being so effective, it means that now she's being lauded while she's bringing in, behind the scenes, these draconian new laws. She has made it such that in future, if she wants to make a new rule, she doesn't have to declare a national state of emergency. She has now taken those powers to the Prime Minister, and if she decides a new rule, she can lock down groups of people, she can shut them in their homes, she can quarantine them if she wishes, she can enter their homes without a warrant. That to me is more concerning, because what if it wasn't about a virus? What if it was a certain religion or a certain political view? Those people can now be detained without any reason. Their businesses can be shut down. That's the darkness that comes hand in hand with the success story on the virus in New Zealand.
A very interesting question says, Katie, would you get a vaccine if one was created for COVID? Would you trust it?
Not a chance, not a chance. And so I don't have the flu vaccine for my son. I'm hoping to be part of some kind of questioning network. What I would love to be able to do with any leverage I have is get people to just question. And so my first question is always, oh, okay, sure, what's in the vaccine? Can you just tell me what the vaccine is? Because no one ever has that answer. What's in it? Because someone delivers it to them with a mask on and a white coat in a hospital setting, maybe using a syringe, there's an assumption that therefore that's the right thing to have. And all I'm trying to do is just shift that one stage back to say, okay, tell me what's in that. Because I think that's how we win. I don't think we win by having big vaccine debates. I think we win by getting people to just say, what are you putting in your child? Or what are you putting in yourself? So no chance for me. My fear is in this country and the way that people have been compliant is that they will start to take away additional freedoms if you don't have compulsory vaccine. So perhaps they will take my passport. Perhaps they will not allow my children to go to school. Perhaps they will take away my right to work. And that's what I think will be used here in the UK. They will take away my rights if I don't have it. So we'll see what happens there. But frankly, prison has never really intimidated me. And the police certainly don't intimidate me. So it's a fight that I'm willing to fight on behalf of if required. But no, I will not be having whatever is in that liquid that they put in that needle.
That is good to hear. Most of us aren't planning to do it either.
No, and in America, I imagine that might be a choice. Whereas here, under socialized healthcare, I suspect it may lead to the fact that your healthcare could be withdrawn. And that's an interesting thing.
Well, from what I hear, a lot of workers within the essential industry are being told that if a vaccine is ready, if they don't take it, they will be fired for not taking the vaccine. So in a way, they're making it forceful, at least making threats toward losing your job and your career if you have been called essential during COVID-19.
Yes, exactly. And it's those sort of lines that make this blurred. I think one of the things I'm trying to just push at the moment, and I say push in a supportive way, is just if you refuse a vaccine, that does not make you an anti-vaxxer. That means that you refused a vaccine. And it is as simple as this in some of this messaging. It's stripping it back so that someone is ready, a mum, you know, who feels obliged and coerced by others, has that first thought of, no, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, I'm just refusing this vaccine. You know, we need to equip people with the tools to be able to articulate their own way of defending themselves, because it is this pressure people feel, and that's what's upsetting me at the moment is emails that I didn't get to read you like this, from a lady who her own daughter is effectively policing the family and therefore stopping her seeing who she wants to see, stopping her going out. And this is happening in families all over, well, all over the globe, is that someone in the friendship group or the family group acts like the kind of COVID police and becomes almost bullying, I think, in nature. And so, you know, some emotionally upsetting things going on with all of this coercion that goes on.
Yeah, but what happened to my body, my choice?
Yeah, out the window.
Again, cherry picking when it comes to rules and regulations. Okay, since we have a little tiny bit of a time left, I will read you a couple of questions from the chat for those who didn't catch the Q&A box, so we play fair.
Sure.
Question says, Katie, do you see this as a stealth agenda to introduce trackable RFID identity card for our safety, of course?
Yeah, so I do see, you know, this COVID as part of a much larger movement. I definitely see this virus as linked to some world power idea. I was just wanting to share the quote, which I'm sure many people will know, but the first Director General of the World Health Organization, so back in, when was it, 1948, to achieve world government, it is necessary to remove from the minds of men their individualism, loyalty to family tradition, national patriotism, and religious dogmas. And I just think that's so fascinating in terms of, you know, look at the way they try, the left try and wrench apart the family by making two mums as good as one mum, as good as three dads, as good as a transsexual and a lesbian. You know, look at the way they try and wrench you apart from the flag. Here, I'm not allowed to fly the St. George's flag because it's seen as a racist symbol. Look at the way that they try and move you from your church or being an individual. You know, these are the people saying to me, they feel pressured today by the peers. And that's exactly what this gentleman said. It's necessary to move away individualism. So I do believe that this is a part of a wider play for some sort of world government. And as we look towards these national vaccine or, you know, a center for epidemics, it feels like the formation of this world government, and certainly this tracking will be a vital part of it. I think there is a sense that we are seeing depopulation of a certain group of individuals. As I mentioned before, whites are a minority increasingly in London, but where is the white and minority ethnic? I am nearly a minority ethnic in my own land. So this depopulation of whites and repopulation with the other, I think, is coming. So certainly I see it as a bigger play for world government, whether people call it New World Order. I know we move into conspiracy territory, but something far bigger is going on. And of course, at a very individual, normal mum of three kids and level, Brit, things were so fantastic. Like, I could not have been more excited. We had Trump firing on all cylinders in the States, still do. We had Boris being bombastic over Brexit. We had Bolsonaro doing fantastically in Brazil. We had Hungary and the Eastern Europeans being very stalwart. Things were just so spectacular. You know, I was like an Energizer bunny on steroids. And of course, then Corona hits. And that is what has been hard as well. I think a lot of us have felt it like a proper punch to the gut, as it has been a bit of a surprising turn of events when things were going so well.
I agree. Normally, last question goes to me. So if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and ask my question. What are your thoughts on London's mayor, Khan?
So, at a personal level, and this is clearly not a very professional nor political opinion, I loathe him. He's short, and I'm not a fan of short people at the best of times. As many at Horowitz will know, he's nipple height. And frankly, any guy that's nipple height is not someone that I can spend a lot of time with. We'll park that because that's unprofessional. My professional opinion is he is the worst mayor of all time. I think him being in power shows the power of the Islamists in our country. When political power is in the hands of the Islamists, it stays with them. We will not see another mayor who is not a Muslim in London in my lifetime, or my children's lifetime, should they live in this country. There is a Muslim Police Association, a Muslim Housing Association, a Muslim body behind every authority and every body that there is. Our mayors of all our towns and cities are now Muslims, and this happens for a reason, because then more finances flow to the Muslim groups, their power base grows, and so the takeover continues. And his control over the transport network, in just to talk about something very specific, he has control of transport for London. What he is doing right now, I was just reading it prior to this, is he is crippling the transport network for London. He has removed any subways or drivers. He's removed any buses and drivers. He's made it so the city is crippled, and he's virtually blackmailing Boris, wanting more money, all sorts of things, before he'll let go of that crippling of our economy, of our city. That's what we've got in charge. He is a despicable little man. And what I would say to Americans is, I'm so sorry if you think he speaks for us. He does not. There is a great place called the rest of the UK. It's where I live. It's where Brexiteers live. We love Trump. There are gays for Trump. There are straight men for Trump. There are crazy women for Trump. We love him. And you may not hear our voices because you're spoken to by this sad little Muslim mayor. But we're here, and it's very much like California and New York. They get the sound and they get the noise, but it's the heart of America, the heart of the rest of the UK is very much with Trump. So I apologize for the Muslim mayor. I loathe the little cretin. And the last time I saw him, I crossed the road to shout in his face, and I had to bend down to do so because he is that short. So just bear that in mind, everybody. Next time you hear from him, he is this high. Okay, good.
Every time I think there is no way I could love you anymore, here you come.
I miss everybody. I miss being in rooms of people. I miss speaking. I miss, talking with crowds. I miss that elation of Trump supporters and Republicans and people fighting for freedom. I know we all miss it, but it makes me emotional. Just feeling the feeling of being in rooms with brilliant Americans fighting for freedom. I know we all miss it. I miss you all dreadfully too.
And that's the thing, Katie. I personally look at it this way. One of the best ways, at least in my motherland, 40 some years ago when the Islamic Revolution happened, the very first thing they did, being the supreme leader who invaded my motherland, the first thing he did, he stopped. It became illegal to have any gatherings of 5 or more people.
Of course.
5 or more people. When you have 5 or more people, especially patriots, truth tellers, courageous people to sit in a room and brainstorm, a spark starts. Let's separate these crowds. Things are getting good. They are winning. They are planning. Their strategy is working. Oh, we have a COVID-19 situation. Everybody locked down. That's how I look at it.
Yeah.
But again, I might be just paranoid.
No, you're smart. And the two things. One, I forgot to say at the front end, I think you look fantastic, by the way. And I just think you look super smashing. So hooray for you, because the thing about our side, of course, not myself, but other women like you look fabulous. And our side, not only do we have a sense of humor, but we have very beautiful women and men like yourself. So hooray for us. And the other thing, of course, is that when this is done, and I will be on that first plane, I hung out in New York with my fingernails until I was really forced to leave by British Airways staff that came and got me, is that we will be back together. And when we're back together, it's going to feel like the top came off a volcano. So I have great faith in America, of course. I'm very sorry for the state of Britain and my compliant brethren here, but the America remains the land of the free, and you are going to be the place that we need to protect and defend. You are now the beating heart of this planet. And when we are all back together, the joy we're going to feel is just, it's giving me goosebumps just thinking about it. So
I don't know if you can see my.
I know.
I have one.
I know. So exciting. So this is going to come, and all we have to do is hold on. And my little last thing probably is, you know, I see us like spiders on a web. I mean, good looking spiders, and not as hairy as spiders, although I'm quite hairy. Anyway, we're spiders on a web. And even though you can't necessarily see those invisible threads between us, they're still there. And sometimes I can feel those vibrations of people when they're hurting or they're happy. You can feel it. And that web is made of steel. So just know that that web is there, you're on it, and when we're back together, we're all going to be spiders vibrating that web together, and it's going to be brilliant.
Amen. Since we have some questions left, Katie, just in case if those people who asked those questions and didn't get an answer,
yes,
where can they come, follow you, ask you those questions, just get updates and all that good stuff?
Yes. What we'll do is two things. Number one, anybody that wants to find me can find me at Twitter, which is like at, and then a K, and then a T, KT, Hopkins, Hopkins. I'm there until they me from there. I'm on Front Page Mag. I write there every week, so frontpagemag.com. And I really want to say thank you to everybody for engaging with Horowitz Freedom Centre, for engaging with the work that you do, and for taking their time to join us this evening. I respect it, and I know people have lots to do, but thank you for joining us.
Of course, and thank you, Katie, for staying up. I know it's pretty late there, so thank you for staying up and talking to us tonight.
Oh, absolutely. It's absolutely a pleasure. I miss you all very much. And remember, you are the land of the free. God bless Donald J. Trump, and God bless America.
Thank you. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for watching. And remember, all of these webinars are brought to you by the David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Glazov Gang for free. So if you like them and if you want them to continue bringing you more webinars like this one, consider making a 100% tax-deductible donation by going to frontpagemag.com. You all stay safe, and we will see you next week. Goodbye.